In 1257, at the Crusader port of Acre, the Count of Jaffa, John of Ibelin, was forced to watch a battle within the walls of his own city. Standing on the battlements of his tower, he watched as men armed with crossbows fired from windows at those across the street, only for the defenders to fire back with equal deadly precision. Heavy bolts from ballistas smashed through stone, while men in the streets hacked at each other with short swords, before fleeing back to the safety of their brothers behind hastily constructed barricades. The streets between the two foes had now become a killing ground, slick with blood. Despondent, the Count turned away towards the sea and watched as a fleet entered the bay, splintering and burning the enemy ships that had been anchored there, before creating a blockade across the harbour. Small boats swarmed across the water, filled with fresh troops that began to fill the narrow streets. The only consolation to all this chaos was that neither side was trying to kill him. Both sides had given their word that no harm would befall the Count, provided he stayed out of the conflict. So he retreated inside, content to do just that. The War of St. Sabas is largely overlooked by history, getting lost in the turmoil of the Crusades and its endless myriad of battles and larger-than-life heroes. Yet it was fought for 14 years on both land and sea between the commercial powers of Venice and Genoa, and drew in the great powers of Christendom. This eternal pointless feud between the two Italian republics all started in 1256 in the city of Tyre, but would dramatically escalate over a small strip of land that neither side owned. In the 13th century, the Republic of Venice was the dominant commercial power on the Mediterranean Sea. Trade was the cornerstone of Venetian society and had allowed the Republic to spread its influence out from its fortified lagoon and across the waves. Its large merchant fleets brought the wealth of the Far East to the hungry markets of Europe in the form of silk, porcelain, spices, furs, and precious stones. In 1204, thanks to the efforts of Doge Enrico Dandolo, a wily, blind adventurer who had stolen the Fourth Crusade and aided in the sack of Constantinople, Venice found itself with a commercial empire, consisting of trading posts and colonies stretching across the eastern Mediterranean, from the Dalmatian coast to Crete, the Greek islands, and the Golden Horn on the Bosphorus. With such far-flung possessions, Dandolo's successors spent years securing their gains, stretching the Republic's resources and manpower to its limits. Venice's small population found it increasingly difficult to garrison its many new possessions. But with an empire comes new advantages. Having removed the Greek Byzantines from Constantinople and replaced them with the rickety house of cards called the Latin Empire, Venice found itself with control over a large portion of the city and a monopoly on the riches that flowed along the Bosphorus and into Europe. With their newfound power, they expelled their arch-rivals, the republics of Genoa and Pisa, from the city and barred them from the lucrative trade. Their rivalry with the Genoese went back for centuries and had often spilled over into bloodshed and open war, greatly upsetting the flow of goods through the region and often dragging in the other great powers of Europe. Genoa was forced to watch with jealousy as the riches of the East lined the pockets of their most hated nemesis. They were denied a presence within the city and were completely barred from entering the fertile waters of the Black Sea and for the potential for colonies along its coast. This bitter resentment would build over the years as the Republic's commercial interests were hindered. Anxiety also grew when the King of France stopped ordering more ships to add to his navy, hindering the city's revenues and dockyards. But the French also refused to pay for the ships that had already been completed, resulting in the bankruptcy of several Genoese banks and causing a serious financial crisis. Genoa was falling behind its old rival, with not just its honor at stake, but also its commercial empire now being put at risk. But help would come from an unlikely source in 1256 from the Crusader state of Tyre under the command of Philip de Montfort. A distinguished knight whose father had died fighting in the Albigensian Crusade, Philip had inherited an adventurous temperament that had allowed him to thrive in the hostile polities of the Levant. After surviving the disastrous calamity of the Seventh Crusade, Philip was given the lordship of Tyre by King Henry of Cyprus. Eager to expand his feudal holdings and attract greater commercial interest, he inserted himself into the feud between the two maritime republics, aligning himself with the Genoese. Offering them sole trading rights in his city, he hoped to expand his port to rival that of Acre and increase his prominence in the region. So in 1256, Philip expelled the entire Venetian quarter from his city and seized what he could of their wealth. When the Venetians fought back, his Italian friends stepped in, driving their rivals into the sea or slaying them outright. Naturally, the Venetians were outraged by these actions, but the Genoese were emboldened by this minor victory, and with a powerful local lord to support them, they quickly set their sights on a new prize. The target would be land in the wealthy port of Acre that was owned by the monks of Mar Saba, a 5th century fortress monastery dedicated to Saint Sabas the Sanctified, located in the Kidron Valley. Somehow the land had fallen into dispute, and was now being claimed by both Venice and Genoa. Acre was a major trading gateway for the Christian East, with its commercial wealth far surpassing that of the entire Kingdom of England. Whoever had the greater access to the port and its surrounding lands would have a clear advantage in the Levantine trade and a potential monopoly on the wealth that flowed from the Silk Road into Europe. With such high stakes, neither side was willing to compromise. So on 1257, war between the two Italian powers began in earnest. Genoa immediately went on the offensive and attempted to seize the Venetian quarter within Acre and gain control of the harbour. Quickly things turned into vicious street fighting as both sides erected barricades to defend their gains, while the Count of Jaffa watched from his tower. When news of the attack reached the lagoon, Venice was in an uproar. Under the expert leadership of Doge Rainier Zeno, he dispatched a fleet of 40 galleys under the renowned command of Admiral Lorenzo Topolo, with orders to take the port. Upon arrival, Topolo blockaded the harbour and offloaded his army, taking sections of the city as well as the disputed land that had started the conflict. But accomplishing his goals would be easier said than done, as the Genoese defenders, some 800 strong, dug in, their famed crossbowmen cutting down Venetian invaders with precision. They were able to bring in supplies from their supporters in Tyre, thanks largely to Montfort's friends, the Knights Hospitaller, whose fortress was close to the Genoese quarter. As the fighting dragged on, Topolo ordered the use of siege weaponry to begin hammering their opponents, destroying fortifications and smashing through buildings. While Acre tore itself apart, Genoa was suffering a popular uprising. The podesta of the city, Filippo della Torre, was embroiled in an embezzlement scheme and put on trial for treason. Frustrated by the lack of progress, the populace rose up and overthrew della Torre and his government, and instead replaced him with a local statesman named Guglielmo Boccanegra, a man who was well respected by the common people as well as the merchant class for his attacks on the nobles and their wealth. Given the new post of captain of the people, he dispatched a fleet of 50 ships to Acre, along with messages to Tyre for a coordinated assault. De Montfort rallied a sortie of 400 men and departed for Acre along with his Hospitaller allies, and arrived just in time to watch the Armada catch the Venetians by surprise. Though at a clear numerical disadvantage, Lorenzo Topolo showed his experience and cunning seamanship by quickly rallying his ships into battle formation and went on the offensive, easily outmaneuvering the cautious Genoese and dealing them a crushing defeat. Montfort was forced to watch on the shore as the fleet that should have taken the city was burned or captured. Some 1,700 men died fighting on the decks or drowned in the harbour. Cursing the Genoese for their incompetence, the Lord remarked, "They were good for nothing but for brothels, and were like fish eating birds flinging themselves into the sea and drowning." Philip then made one of his signature survivalist moves and escaped back to Tyre. Though Tyre would be subject to a week-long blockade by the Venetian navy, Montfort would remain largely absent from the remainder of the conflict. With no help coming and supplies dwindling, the besieged Genoese in their quarter were forced to flee with their allies or surrender. Venice would hold Acre and much of the Levantine trade throughout the remainder of the war, and Admiral Topolo would be a celebrated hero back home. Despite the setback, Genoa would not sit idle. Though they had lost their supporters in the Holy Land, they would find a new friend in the Emperor of Nicaea, Michael VII Palaeologos, who was eager to find support and funds for his own war with the Latin Empire. In a masterstroke of diplomacy, Boccanegra signed the Treaty of Nymphaeum on the 13th of March, 1261, gaining exclusive trading rights within Nicaea and furnishing the Republic with a new fleet of 50 galleys. 2 weeks later, The house of cards that was the Latin Empire came tumbling down when General Strategopulus captured Constantinople and restored Byzantine rule. With the Palaeologus dynasty now in control of the city, it was Genoa's time to shine, as all the previous privileges held by Venice were heaped upon them. With a place at the emperor's table and a brand new enlarged quarter to garrison, they could resume their expansion into the Black Sea and dominate the lucrative trade with the Mongol horde. Although the emperor would tolerate the Venetians to remain in his city, their quarter was greatly reduced, and they were stripped of all power, leaving them out in the cold. Though a triumph for the captain of the people, and a humiliation for Venice, Boccanegra would not be able to enjoy his victory for long. Though he had been brought to power by the common people, his policies had made enemies of Genoa's old families, who, in May of 1262, overthrew him in a bloody coup, slaughtering his supporters in the city square and forcing the old captain of the people into exile. He would never see his home again, and die in France in 1273. Taking advantage of the chaos, Doge Zeno ordered Admiral Dandolo into the Aegean Sea and to engage the Genoese fleet just off the island of Setaposi. Although the Genoese once again had numerical superiority, 48 ships to Venice's 32, they would play it safe by being overly cautious. Only 14 ships would charge into the battle under the fiery command of Pietro Avvocato, while the others fled. It would be an embarrassing defeat, with the death of the admiral and 600 of his men to Dandolo's 20. Those that had fled would later be charged with cowardice back in Genoa. However, the Genoese navy would restore some of its pride in August of 1264 when it captured a large Venetian merchant fleet at Cesena, taking 17 ships and over £100,000 worth of cargo, a full year's worth of profit, a handsome sum that certainly lined the pockets of all those involved, and was a welcome contribution to the Genoese war effort. For the remainder of the conflict, the two rivals would engage in commercial raiding, attacking trading posts and merchant fleets alike, but refusing to commit to a major battle. Both hired large numbers of Turkic and Egyptian mercenaries to man their galleys, with Genoa going so far as to try to entice the Mamelukes to conquer Acre. In short, the war had spiraled out across the Mediterranean and was now interrupting commerce across the seas with no end in sight. Though the two feuding cities were content to fight for another decade, many were growing tired of the conflict. Most prominent was Emperor Michael, who had an empire to rebuild and a ravaged capital to repopulate. The commercial wealth that he had expected to reap from his new Italian friends had not materialized, and instead the resources that he had invested were being swallowed up by the black hole of Genoa's war. Furious with them, he began secret talks with the Venetians in 1265 to remove his empire from the conflict, offering to restore much of their former privileges within his dominion. Yet Zeno would play an aloof game of diplomacy, drawing out the talks for years as a means of extracting as many new benefits as possible. In April of 1268, he would ratify a 5-year treaty with the emperor, restoring much of Venice's lost commercial interests. Michael had learned from his experiences with both sides to know not to elevate one over the other, but would instead pit the two republics against each other for imperial favor. With the Byzantines now out, all Zeno needed was a victory to cement a new career high. That high would come in June when the Grand Fleet rounded Sicily and entered Genoese waters under the command of Jacopo Dandulo. Once again, neither fleet would engage the other, instead playing a far-off game of cat and mouse. The Genoese admiral, Lanfranco Borbardino, was overly cautious, a sentiment that had plagued the Genoese navy throughout the war. He also didn't trust his men, who were mostly Lombard mercenaries, and doubted their abilities. Rather than engage his opponent, he anchored his fleet at Trapani and lashed his vessels together with chains, creating a defensive fortress that allowed his men to easily cross from one ship to the next. He also hired large numbers of local Trapanese to bolster his army and waited for the Venetians. On the 23rd of June, Dandulo sighted his prey and ordered the attack. The Venetian galleys came crashing against Borbardino's fleet. Men swarmed across the decks and spilled blood into the crystal waters. The chains strained, but the defense held. Dandulo ordered his ships to reform and strike again, and on the third try, the chains buckled, then shattered, and the Genoese galley fortress began to fall apart. With their morale at an all-low due to their commander's caution, men dove into the sea and tried to reach the shore, while the Venetians captured the fleet. Over 1,200 crewmen would drown with only a handful reaching safety. In total, 24 vessels would be captured by Venice, while 3 would be sunk. Dandolo would sail back to the lagoon and be hailed as a hero. The 600 Genoese he took captive would rot in the prisons beneath the Doge's palace for the remainder of the war. With victory in one hand and the Byzantine treaty in the other, Doge Zeno, at the height of his career, made a quiet retreat and passed away a month later on the 7th of July. His position would be filled by Admiral Lorenzo Topolo, the hero of Acca. Though the defeat for Genoa was humiliating, both sides still refused to compromise and returned to commercial raiding instead. However, by now the rest of Europe had become exhausted by the conflict, with both the Crusaders and the Church demanding some kind of peace. Eventually, King Louis IX of France would bring his authority to bear. Eager for another crusade, he would need both republics' ships to transport his army to the Holy Land. So, in 1270, the begrudging Italians would be forced to meet and sign the Treaty of Cremona, agreeing to an uneasy 5-year truce. And with that, the war was over. The fighting that had grown out of the small land dispute had lasted 14 years and claimed more than 20,000 lives. A small number considering the length of the conflict, but since the Crusader states were perpetually short of manpower, it was a significant loss. The Crusaders were left the task of repairing Acca, with much of its fortifications having been destroyed in the fighting, leaving the city nearly defenseless. Both Genoa and Venice would secure their commercial dominance, with Genoa finally regaining its lost quarter in Acca in 1288. Yet neither side would have the last laugh. Just 3 years later, on April 4th, 1291, the armies of the Mamluk Sultan, Al-Ashraf Khalil, captured Acca and Mar Saba's disputed land. The defenders were either enslaved or driven into the sea. The Sultan would close the book on the Crusader states and brought an end to the Jerusalem Crusades and any hope of Christian dominance in the East. What's more, both republics would be at war again in 1294, once again picking a fight over commerce and trade in the Black Sea, making the entire War of St. Sabas largely a grim and pointless conflict.